Okay. So where we left off last time was with the question, does Machiavelli have an underlying preference for the people and their safety? This would be a part of the argument that Machiavelli is primarily motivated by his patriotism, or his love for the Italian people, or at least the country that he envisions for Italy. In chapter 9, we see him arguing that the favor of the people is very important. That is, that their approval of the prince is very important. And as I've said before, this is a pretty interesting and new and innovative thought, because at this time, this was a feudal society. This was a society ruled by aristocrats, by nobles, who very generally thought that that the people were sort of beneath their notice. Okay, they were there to serve them. This was an era where there were still many serfs farming the land for the nobles, and they were sort of like slaves, almost like slaves. They had a little bit more independence, but they couldn't just leave when they wanted to. Not only were they tied legally to the land that they worked for the nobles, but also if they left, they had no protections. The nobles provided protection for them. So anyway, this was a feudal society in which the people were considered workers, free labor in a lot of cases, and they were considered far beneath the dignity of the nobles. So the idea that a prince or a noble should think about what the people think of him, beyond not wanting to be, you know, revolted against anyway, would be rather new, rather contestable. Okay? But Machiavelli argues that the reason why we should look to the people is because they are easier to please. Okay? Now, he knows that another reason is because if they get angry enough, they will revolt or they can do something against you. But actually, that was really rare at that time, because the people were kept down enough that they would not do that under almost all circumstances. But this is an interesting reason. The people are easier to please. They have fewer expectations because of the way that they live. Okay? They live simple lives. They're simple people. They don't have grand ambitions. All right? And really, what they want primarily is just to be left alone. The biggest problem for the peasant is that the nobles wreak havoc upon them. Okay? Depending on, you know, who they work for, the noble can be the peasant's worst enemy. Okay? He can go and the nobles at this time had the right to go and live off of the peasant for as long as they wanted, to demand basically fare for as long as they wanted, to eat them out of house and home. They could come and take as much money as they had. They really had pretty strong rights over these people. So really the people would be happy if they got a prince or a nobleman above them that just pretty much left them alone, that, you know, set a certain number of days when they had to work for them, and left them alone, didn't take too much of their money, didn't bother their women, as we'll get to that in a little bit. But that was a problem as well. Sometimes the nobles would come into the village or where the people were who were working for them, and they would actually demand or simply take their daughters and do what they wanted to with them. So this is why they're easy to please, because really all they want is to be left alone. So Machiavelli says, therefore, a prince ought to think of a mode, which means way, whereby his citizens always and in every quality of time have need of the state and of him. And then they will always be faithful to him. Okay? If they can see that with him they are better off, because they are safer, because they are not as preyed upon by the nobles, okay, they will support him. They will be very faithful to him because they will be grateful for them. And now you contrast this with the nobles that a prince would have to deal with. In this feudal system, the nobles were under the prince, but not really, not all the time. These nobles had their own territories and people who worked for them, and even soldiers who worked for them. And so they were really kind of independent power bases that a prince had to try to control. Okay? Now people like that, who have their own castles, who have their own arms, who have their own people, servants working for them and so forth, they have very high expectations. They want more power, more money, and so forth. And if they're upset, they can actually try to overturn the prince's power. So this is the reason he uses. Here you've got one class of people who's easily satisfied, and they're the vast majority. Okay? And if you get them on your side, you have a lot of power, just, with their approval. On the other side, you have these few people over here who can never be satisfied, who are always thinking about overturning you if they get a chance. Okay? And the more that you give them, the more they want to take. So, who would you choose to favor? And who would you choose to weaken? Machiavelli says you weaken the nobles and you strengthen the people. You get the people on your side. Okay? Now, does Machiavelli say all this because he loves the people? Well, that's a matter of opinion or conjecture. Okay? Some people say that underlying all this, he really does. He lived out there with them for a long time, and even though he calls them vulgar, perhaps he had an affection for them and understood the common people and appreciated their point of view. We don't need to see it that way. I mean, his attitude towards them is often condescending. Well, at the very least, he's saying they're a powerful force, okay? And you can use that powerful force and harness it to your advantage. And so you need to think of their own good. Now, in chapters 12 through 14, let me shrink this a little bit. In chapters 12 through 14, we have an extended argument about what type of military the prince should use. And this ties into this argument that the people's power and favor is important, because Machiavelli is going to argue for a completely different way of doing war. Okay? And we'll talk about, exactly what used to be the case and how he's trying to change it. But in chapter 12, Machiavelli says, the principal foundations on which the power of all government is based are good laws and good armies. And since there cannot be good laws where there are not good armies, and since where there are good armies there must be good laws, I will omit any discussion of laws and we'll talk about armies. Okay? Well, that's a wonderful statement, a famous statement by Machiavelli that emphasizes how important he thought the use of force was, how important he thought the army was. The army, the embodiment of the prince's power, is what provides stability, provides security, and so forth. And if you don't have that basic stability and security in a world like his, where everything's up for grabs, you really can't have good laws. You can't have any sort of good government, because things will be changing so much. Everything will be insecure. Any rule that is passed can be disobeyed if you don't have good armies. In this day, there wasn't, a separate police force, a civilian, police force in the army. The army, was what would provide the security and order within the state as well as without. Okay? So here he's saying the most fundamental aspect of good laws, the most fundamental source of good laws, is good armies. And so I'm not even going to talk about good laws. I'm going to talk about armies, because until you get that, then you can't even really start with laws. Okay? Now, does this mean that laws are irrelevant? Not at all. Okay, we see lots of evidence in Machiavelli that laws are very important. The most important thing about the laws is that they be known and consistent and consistently enforced. Okay? Well, you can't have any of them without good armies, without the ability to give the prince the security he needs to enforce them and the ability to enforce them. Okay? But he really thinks that the worst thing about Italian laws is that while they're out there, they change according to the whim of the prince, or when personnel change. They're sort of capriciously enforced. Lots of times, depending on who you are, the law would be enforced or not enforced, and so forth. Okay? So Machiavelli is proposing using the army to set up the conditions where laws can be consistently and equally enforced. Okay? Not to give certain people exemptions, as the nobles always expected, but to hold everybody to the same conditions. Okay? You need a lot of power for that. Okay. So then Machiavelli turns to What kind of army is best? Okay. Well, here are the 4 types of armed forces that he discusses. Okay. And we're familiar with some of these, but not with others. So I'm going to go through each of them and discuss what they are. Mercenaries are paid soldiers. Okay. They would have been men sometimes from the immediate area, sometimes from far away. Companies of men who worked together to fight for whoever would hire them. Okay. They came fully equipped. They were very seasoned fighters in a lot of cases. And more during Machiavelli's time, people were using mercenaries, professional forces to fight their battles. Okay? Now, before Machiavelli's time, before the Renaissance, well, before it was the 13th century even, the primary fighters were the nobility themselves. This was beginning to change in his time. Okay? But prior to, say, the 13th century, most all the time, the nobles fought battles amongst each other. And part of the reason for this, a big part of the reason, was that they were the ones wealthy enough to buy the armor and to supply the horse and so forth necessary to do this. Okay? And of course, they had the most immediate interest in doing so. And actually, the nobles, with all the leisure that they had, considered it their job to continually practice the arts of war. And that's why they had the tournaments and the jousting, the constant fighting that they did as a sort of game during the Middle Ages was a preparation for the actual battles that they would have to fight. So the nobles, of course, considered themselves, even during Machiavelli's time, as the professional soldiers par excellence. They were the ones who came with the breeding, with the training, with the proper equipment, and they had fulfilled this role for a long, long time. A third type of armed force is the auxiliaries, and Machiavelli discusses them. These are really nobles, too, for the most part, but they're nobles from other countries. And, a leader could use his own men, but he could also ally himself with a foreign country and ask for their troops and supplies, too. So he would usually get, as the Pope did with Cesare, talking to the French, he got French nobles to come in and help him to win that battle. And finally, and sorry about the numbering system there, fourth, citizens could be fighters. But this had not been the case for most of the history of mankind, okay? During the Roman Empire, we have a wonderful example of citizen soldiers, okay? It was still the case that the upper crust were the commanders, but in order to get the vast armies that they employed for their empire, they reached out to the citizenry, and they had these huge citizen armies. Well, from the collapse of the Roman Empire, you get the medieval period in Europe, and from that point on, there's no citizen soldiers during most of the Middle Ages. But then, towards the time of the Renaissance, they start to rethink that. And part of the rethinking has to do with rediscovering the Roman past and seeing how the Roman Empire did things. Machiavelli was very much a part of that rethinking. He was actually put in charge of an experimental force of citizen soldiers in Florence to see whether they could actually fight. And this was very controversial, because for the longest time during the Middle Ages, the nobles had said, the citizens can't fight. They're constitutionally incapable of fighting. Okay? They're cowardly. They don't have any courage. They don't have the noble blood running through their veins, so they're useless. And here comes Machiavelli, and he was one of a few who said, no, not at all. The only thing they lack is equipment and training, but they can actually be better fighters than the nobles were. So this was a new idea, relatively speaking, but it harked back to that ancient Roman past. Okay. Now the question is, which of these armies did Machiavelli favor, and why? Well, let's look at mercenaries first. Okay? These are men who are paid to fight. Okay? What would be the strengths of an army or group of men who were paid to fight, for whom that was their sole job and responsibility?
They'd be better at it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no cost in the training of them. They come ready to use.
Right. So you don't have to train them, you don't have to equip them, right? And they have lots of experience, right? So they're hardened, so to speak, by their experience. So you don't have to bother with anything other than finding them and employing them, okay? What are the weaknesses? What would the prince have to worry about? Yeah.
There's no pride. There's no pride in what they're fighting for.
Loyalty.
Yeah. Loyalty, pride are issues, right? Right. Because they're not fighting for anything other than the bottom line, their profit. They might take professional pride. I assume many of them very much did, professional pride in their ability to fight. But the kind of pride that you're referring to is pride of place. In other words, pride in what they're protecting. They would have no identification with what they were protecting. Okay? So the prince asked them to come in and say, fight for Florence. They're not from Florence. Okay? They don't care about Florence. They don't love Florence. Okay? So they don't have that, as you say, loyalty. Okay? That's a big liability. Okay? Now, with men who are paid to fight and make money in that way, what happens if it looks as though they're going to be defeated? What do you suppose that they would do? Do you think that they would stand and fight to the bitter end and risk their lives? That doesn't make any sense. Okay? If that is your living, okay, and you have no loyalty to the place, then it makes absolute sense to run away. Now, not until it's hopeless, but you certainly don't want to risk your life unnecessarily when you're in this for a career, right? So Machiavelli knows that the people are not willing to risk their lives in this situation. They are willing to risk their lives if they believe that they're fighting for their homeland, that they love the place where they live, or that they're fighting for the safety of their children and their wife and so forth. But otherwise, I think he suspects that they will simply run away when the going gets tough. Also, we have this problem. Okay? What happens if somebody comes along and offers a whole lot more money? Okay? Now, in a lot of cases, mercenary soldiers would still stay because they would not want to get a reputation for being extremely fickle, or nobody would hire them. But there's still this, possibility, especially if it looks as though they're not going to win on one side, okay, to be able to switch to the other, because money is what they're all about. All right, so the message here is, from Machiavelli, is you just can't trust them. You cannot trust them. So they're not reliable. They certainly wouldn't be your first choice. Machiavelli doesn't rule out the use of any type of force because he realizes that sometimes you must use less than optimal, forces. But this is not your first choice because you cannot trust them. So then we turn to nobility. And as I said, this was the most common fighting force. Their strengths include the fact that they are already equipped too, so they share that with the mercenaries, right? They have all their equipment. They have the training because they've been doing it their whole lives. Okay? They have a pride in their ability. Okay? But what are some of their weaknesses? What do you suppose? Okay? Remember that these are folks that live in the land of that the prince governs, but they themselves have their own individual fiefdoms or territories that they control. Okay? Is there anything about having their own land that actually could be a liability for the prince and trying to get them to fight for him?
If they saw they were about to be defeated, would they just flip sides to save their own house?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because the first concern of a person like that will be their own lands, right? And so if it looks as though, as you say, if it looks as though they're about to be defeated, they are likely to switch sides. That's one possibility, so that they can ally themselves with the stronger prince and therefore save their land. Okay? At the very least, when they fight, they're going to be keeping one eye on their own lands as the number one, agenda that they have. Okay, so they're not going to fight equally for all parts of the prince's land. They're going to be thinking more of themselves, more of protecting their own place. So, and vassals, by the way, are those lesser nobles who are under the noble, the knights. Okay. Another liability is that these people may be looking for an opportunity to replace you, okay? And may have been looking for that all along. These are people who don't have any special loyalty to you, the prince, as an individual. They think of themselves as very much worthy of ruling too. And they may have long resented the leadership of the prince, and they may just be looking for an opportunity to replace you, so that when a war comes along and your power is weakened, they may simply use that, whether it means switching sides or just simply deciding to attack you. They may use it to gain their own power. So again, guess what? Machiavelli is saying you can't trust them. Now that is a more shocking proposal than you can't trust mercenaries. I think a lot of people would agree with that. Though you have to use them lots of times, I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that's right, you can't really trust them. Their money is the most important thing. But nobles? Okay, these are people who have vowed to serve the prince in a holy oath, okay, who have, vowed their undying loyalty to this man, right, who say that they uphold honor and chivalry, okay, and would never do anything untoward, and nothing unjust. Machiavelli is saying that those people can be just as ruthless as any prince ever thought of being, okay? And that's really true. There was the code of chivalry, which all of them paid homage to and lip service to. And some of them did honor it. But lots of times the code of chivalry was ignored if the individual's interests clashed with it. Okay? So that, if a vassal pledged an oath to his lord, that didn't mean that he would keep it under certain circumstances. This was especially a big problem in Italy of this time. It was one of the reasons for the great instability. Okay? All right, so you can't trust them. A third fighting force were auxiliaries. These were troops that are borrowed from another ruler. And as I said, these were mainly also the nobles of another country, and who would come in and would help you fight your battles. Okay? So they have the strengths of the nobles, they're trained and so forth. They know what they're doing. You don't have to buy their equipment. Okay? But they have some weaknesses too. What do you think would be on the prince's mind as he deals with the foreign country, its prince, and as he deals with the troops that come to him to help him fight? What's he going to have to worry about? Mm-hmm.
They might be skilled in a way that isn't really helpful to him. I mean, to take an example, if you were like to recruit a Spanish Armada and you're in the middle of, a desert, it's not really help. So
yes.
You might not have the specific training to help the cause.
Very good, yes. They wouldn't know your terrain. They wouldn't be familiar with the way of fighting in that terrain necessarily, depending on where they come from. And so they may not be as skilled, probably wouldn't be as skilled as your own nobles, because they don't know the land, and they may not be equipped to deal with the type of fighting that takes place in your area. Yeah. Anything else that the prince would have to worry about?
A false loyalty,
Mm-hmm.
where they might be there on the best pretenses, but actually they're there to undermine your authority, power, and move you right out of the equation.
Right, exactly. The reason why a foreign government sends troops may not be the reason that they state, right? You say, please help me, I'm in a desperate situation, I need, we're allies, but send some of your troops. The prince on the other end says, okay, sure, I'll send a nice big force, and once they get there, I'll make sure that they know that they're supposed to stay. They can help him fight to get rid of the enemy, but then they'll stay, and they'll have to, either take over the land themselves, or else at least force you to come to some sort of agreement with the foreign power who sent them, right? So there may be a hidden agenda. Whenever foreign troops come into your land, you cannot control them. They're controlled by their lord. They're controlled by their prince. And they may not have the agenda you think. So once they're there, you're in danger. They're a potential enemy. Now, you know, I mean, it's interesting the way Machiavelli thinks, but he's definitely not wrong here. I mean, this also happened all the time. So when you bring in foreign troops, you can pay a very high price. All right, so let me just, we've already talked about this, but let me just put this up here for a bit. Their weaknesses include that they are loyal to their prince and not to you, okay? And that they may stay in the territory that they help conquer. And if they do, then what are you going to do? You brought them in because you couldn't do it by yourself, okay? So you've already displayed weakness to these people and let them know that you cannot handle this by yourself. You need their superior arms. Once they're there, they can do what they want with those arms, all right? So again, you can't trust them. So what do we have? We have three different types of fighting force, all of which for various reasons you can't trust, okay? Because they have their own interests that are separate from yours. That's why you can't trust them. So then, having set all that up and sort of contradicted some of the prejudices of the day, Machiavelli then looks at the fourth type of military force, and this is the type that was, as I say, least used at the time. It was considered a new idea, even though it was an old idea. Okay, it was new for the Europeans. Okay, and Machiavelli is a proponent of this idea. He very much believes that if Florence and maybe other Italian city-states use their own people, that they'll be better off. Now, they do have weaknesses. Let's think about the weaknesses first. Okay. Unlike all the other three, they are not trained. Most of these folks would be farmers. Okay? Maybe never picked up anything like, you know, a weapon of any kind, sword or pike or anything like that. Wouldn't know how to carry such a thing. Maybe wouldn't, you know, horsemanship was extremely important for fighting at this time. And they may have ridden a horse, probably had, but to be able to ride a horse and fight at the same time took a lot of skill. Okay? So they would have to be trained a lot, and you would have to supply all the stuff because they wouldn't be able to afford it themselves. So this would be a major outlay of the government, okay, to be able to supply all the arms, all the armor, and the horse when necessary, and so forth. Okay? Lots of weaknesses, and not to mention the weakness of everybody would admit, including Machiavelli at this time, the weakness of intellect. Okay, they believed that. I think Machiavelli believed it too. These were people who didn't read, they didn't know anything about history, they had no clue about strategy. No. But Machiavelli has got an idea that with proper leadership, it really doesn't matter whether they know anything or not. That if they can learn to obey orders, that they can still do very well. Okay? So let's think about some of their strengths. Well, unlike the other three, Machiavelli believes that citizens are most likely to fight with great enthusiasm for you, the prince. Okay? Machiavelli thinks that mercenaries won't fight enthusiastically at all. They'll leave when the going gets tough. Nobles will fight pretty enthusiastically, but for themselves. Okay? Auxiliaries will fight enthusiastically for the aims of their leader. Okay? But only the citizens have the potential for fighting with zeal for you, the prince. Okay? And more than any other group, he believes that they will be willing to risk their lives. And at this time, the nobles you know, I mean, for much of the past, the nobles, when they did fight, would fight for a time and then they would go away. You know, some people would die and then they would decide, well, to call it a day, and they would go home. You know, fighting was not a terribly bloody affair, okay? Not compared to when popular armies started to come into being, and that's what Machiavelli is talking about, okay? These are people who realize, or should realize, that their land, more importantly, their wives, their children, their parents, all of that is at stake. And they will only do this, of course, if they believe that you, the prince, are providing protection for these people, that you are the best answer to their safety and their future prosperity. So here's where we get back to this theme of the patriot, Machiavelli the patriot, because what he's advising is, if you provide good government, okay, which provides security and the means for prosperity, then the people will be satisfied with you and they will fight enthusiastically for you. And there is no force on the face of the earth that is more frightening and more powerful in his view than an enthused popular army with these reasons. You have their numbers, okay? The nobles are few, the people are many. So you can now harness a much huger fighting force, okay? And especially at this time when most people were still fighting with smaller forces, the country, he thought, that came up with this first and really employed this well would be unbeatable, okay? Because of the great numbers. More would die, okay? And we're looking into the future here, okay? We're looking into the 19th and 20th century, too. More of them would die, but their numbers would be so overwhelming, okay? Now, the first person to really try this with great success was Napoleon, actually, in the 18th century. But Machiavelli sort of foresees that change, foresees that turn towards citizen armies, and tries it, but not with much success in his particular experiment. Okay? Now, there's another weakness here that we didn't mention, and that is, if you don't give them good government, they can turn those arms against you. So Machiavelli is setting up a situation where once you give these people arms and train them, you then do have to please them, don't you? Okay, because if you don't, then they will know what to do with you. Okay, so he would seem to be setting up a situation where the prince absolutely must think of the well-being of the people. Okay, and in doing so, he will make himself powerful, make his city more powerful, and so forth. But he won't be able to ignore them anymore. So Machiavelli says on page 39, experience shows individual sovereigns and republics that arm the masses are capable of making vast conquests. Okay. He couldn't be thinking of himself and his small experiment with a very small militia against the Spaniards, because that failed. They were routed. The Spanish nobles just ate them for breakfast. But he must be thinking of the Romans, okay, the ancient Roman Empire, and how they used their huge armies not only to protect themselves, but to conquer vast stretches of territory. Okay? This is the way to get glory. And of course, Machiavelli wants to unify Italy. He wants to find a prince who will have enough power and enough military might to take on all of these smaller princes and different types of governments and get rid of all of the opponents in Italy and make it one country. So he thinks he's got a recipe here for doing that. Okay? All right, but characteristic of the Renaissance thought in general was this harking back to the ancients, particularly ancient Rome, but also ancient Greece, as being a sort of golden age, as an ideal time in which people did everything better, did art and music and letters and government and the art of war, and everything was better. And Renaissance, as I said before, means rebirth. It was the rebirth of ancient ideas. Okay, So Machiavelli is very much in tune with the Renaissance here, and he too is saying, you know, this past, the ancient Roman past, was a glorious one. We need to imitate it. We need to emulate it because we have fallen into corruption. We have fallen into weakness. We don't remember lots of the tricks and lots of the tools that they used so well, and we need to remember that. Okay? In the Discourses, the other book that he wrote, he praises Roman leadership to the heights in all the ways that they used their troops and all the ways that they inspired their people, okay? The way that they employed religion as a sort of patriotic tool in order to get people to love their country and to believe in it and fight for it. Okay. Now, Cesare Borgia comes up again. Good old Cesare. Remember, he's the man who was so good at deception that he was able to use violence against the people of the Romagna but distance himself from it and become loved, or at least respected by them. Well, he appears again on page 43 where Machiavelli talks about how he initially got power by using auxiliaries, but then he switches to his own troops. So Cesare is another example of somebody who experimented with citizen militia and to better success. So he says on the bottom of page 43, a wise ruler, therefore, will always avoid using mercenary and auxiliary troops and will rely on his own forces. He would rather lose with his own troops than win with someone else's, for he will not regard it a true victory if it is won with troops that do not belong to him. I never hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia as a model to be imitated. This duke entered the Romagna with an auxiliary army, for his troops were all Frenchmen, and he used it to take Imola and Forlì. But since he did not feel such troops were reliable, he then switched over to mercenaries, believing that using them involved fewer risk, and so he hired the Orsini and the Vitelli. But in practice, he found them unreliable, treacherous, and dangerous, and so he got rid of them and formed his own army. Okay? And he would have used and did use both nobles, but primarily citizens, primarily ordinary people. So Machiavelli admires this man again for his astuteness. He used what he had to use at the time, but as soon as he could move on to something superior, he did. He never let those auxiliaries or mercenaries get out of control to where he could not change to a better strategy. Okay? So, what is Machiavelli's overall political message here? Well, the first message we clearly get is that the number one responsibility of the ruler is war. Okay? What should he spend most of his time thinking about? Preparing for war, defending his city, and even expanding its territory if possible. So that's his number one responsibility. Okay? Not his only one, but his number one. Okay? Secondly, in order to be truly successful, he must avail himself of his common citizens. Okay, that's the second lesson. You cannot be as powerful as you would otherwise be unless you can appeal to your citizens and use them as soldiers. Thirdly, in order to obtain the loyalty of your citizens, which you need to give them arms, you must provide them with good government and good laws. Okay? So that's it in a nutshell. Now, you know, if we didn't examine this at length, we would not get it, I think. You know, if you read the Prince in a sort of, you know, cursory way, what you get is that, you know, the Prince needs to crush the people, be cruel to them, be harsh, be demanding, and so forth. And you do not get this message that they're the most important element here. But if you slow down and really take a look what he's saying, and these military passages are often overlooked because people don't like to read about the military anymore. It seems arcane, or, you know, it's tedious or whatever. A lot of books, a lot of collections even skip over this entirely and leave it out. Like if they're, you know, just giving you parts of the Prince and not others, they'll leave this out. I guess they consider it boring. But this is central, okay? to his teaching. Okay? Good laws come from good arms come from popular armies. Okay? So therefore, the prince needs to think of the people. He needs to make an alliance with the people. Okay? And Machiavelli can be seen here to be basically saying, you need to make an agreement with the people. It's a sort of tacit agreement. Okay? It took later philosophers to come up with the term social contract and elaborate all that and so forth. But, I mean, this is the beginning of it. You make an alliance or an agreement with the people, you keep the upper hand, but you have to have that agreement with the people in order to create a stable and more successful city. Okay, so Machiavelli goes so far as to say the best fortress for the prince is the support of the people. This was at a time when many people thought that the best fortress was a fortress, okay? That, you know, the best that you could do is build big walls. You know, have a nice big tall castle, build a big moat around it, big walls around that, because that would give you lots of cover, you know, to fight from, to retreat into, and so forth. Okay? Nothing could be better than a walled city, you know, where you have everybody lives inside this big wall. Okay? But Machiavelli says the wall can be your worst enemy if your people don't like you, if your people don't approve of you, if your people are your enemy, then, you know, that wall's not going to do you any good. Okay? And if your people are your best friend, if the people support you and will fight to the death for you, you don't need a wall. And you're not going to be attacked very often because other cities are going to know that you are very dangerous. So this is conducive to peace, actually. Arming yourself to the teeth with your people is conducive to peace. Because you become so formidable. So this is a great example of Machiavelli as a patriot, or at least as an advocate of a sort of popular government. Okay? Now in this book, he's never going to say, okay, and once you get all this done, step down and create a republic. But he does say that in his other book, you know, that there's one set of methods for establishing a stable city or government. And then there's another set of methods for making it stable and long-lasting. And that second set involves setting up a republican or representative type government where the people actually have some say in their government. Their government, a republic of their time, was not like ours. Okay, you know, most of the people in charge would be nobles. The common people, would have limited ability to vote. Okay, but there would be some input, and the nobles and the common people would have to interact and listen to each other. Okay, so that certainly is a very strong part, or a strong area for Machiavelli the Patriot. Okay, before I move on from that theme, does anybody have any questions or comments about Machiavelli's advice on military matters and how that ties in with his political vision?
One of the provisions says that that's for people to fear you. But I kind of got the impression that you were saying that you need the walls, that it's not fear that he wants, but I guess it could be something to that fear involved as well, but it seems to me that there's deeply kind of a reverence for him.
Yes, right. And you can have both. We're going to look at that later on in this next subject. But, you know, it's good that you bring this up now, because what we've been talking about could be seen as contradicting that. Machiavelli has said that it's very important to be feared. Fear is the number one thing that you have to achieve with people so that they don't get out of line and don't basically have contempt for your leadership and so forth. He still believes that. Okay? They have to be reminded that ultimately the government can crush them, you know, if they get out of line. But if there's nothing but fear at your disposal, that can turn very quickly into hatred. If the only thing that you've got going for your government is terror, and you have to prolong that for very long, people are going to hate you, and Machiavelli also says the last thing you want is to be hated, because when people hate you, they become so passionate against you that they'll be willing to do anything to get rid of you, risk their lives, their lands, and so forth. So how do you walk that middle ground? Well, you walk it by trying to get their respect too. Okay? that you have the fear, but you also have, as you say, the reverence. And that comes from looking like a worthwhile leader, so that the people can say, yes, he is harsh. If I step out of line, I'm gonna fear him a great deal. But he's providing all of these things that are good. He seems to be a good leader. As long as I obey the rules, which are reasonable, then I'll be okay. So it has to be that balance. We'll talk about that more as we get into the virtues that Machiavelli recommends. But first, I want to turn to chapter 15. Okay? Because chapter 15 is central for Machiavelli's understanding of himself. It's always important to try to figure out how a philosopher understands himself or herself, as opposed to how other people may understand him. Okay? Because I think that you have to give the person credit for his own self-understanding. Okay? I'm not a person who likes to psychoanalyze, so I give a lot of credence to what the thinker actually says. In chapter 15, Machiavelli clearly identifies himself as a new breed of philosopher. He thinks of himself as somebody very different from thinkers of the past. Okay? Somebody who's very innovative, and in particular here he distinguishes himself from the ancient past, okay, from the pagan past, and also from the Christian past, okay, of the medieval period. Now, in this part, he's distinguishing himself primarily from philosophers such as we just got done covering, Plato. Plato, Aristotle, in the Roman tradition, Cicero, and others who are idealists, okay, who thought of, the first role of the philosopher is to make people better. Okay, so he distinguishes himself from that. Also, though, even though he admires the ancient Romans, he doesn't admire their lack of planning. The one thing that comes through in the discourses is they did things pretty well, but they did them sort of haphazardly as opportunity arose. They did not plan. And Machiavelli believes that his thought is superior because he plans. He's got the overall big picture and plan for you to follow if you want to be successful, whereas the Romans just sort of discovered things over time. All right? And he distinguishes himself from the Christian perspective as well, which was still the dominant perspective of his time. This doesn't mean that he was not himself a Christian. There's lots of people who debate about whether that was the case or not. But rather, he thinks that he's got a way of thinking that contradicts the basic moral perspective of the medieval Christians. Okay? So, Machiavelli depicts himself as what he calls an architect or a maker of new modes and orders, okay, which means new ways of doing things, new pattern to follow, okay, and as an ultra-realist. On page 48, he gives us his reasons. So up at the top of page 48, he says, "But my hope is to write a book that will be useful, at least to those who read it intelligently. And so I thought it sensible to go straight to the discussion of how things are in real life and not waste time with the discussion of an imaginary world. For many authors have constructed imaginary republics and principalities that have never existed in practice and never could. For the gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to an ideal will soon discover he has been taught how to destroy himself, not how to preserve himself." Okay. So when he mentions the authors who have constructed imaginary republics, this is a very noticeable reference to Plato and Plato's republic and the whole ideal city. And in general, he's discussing authors who are idealists, who come up with ideal schemes of living or ideal notions of justice. But what's interesting here is the reason he gives for rejecting these. He says, not only do people not conform to these ideals, okay, nobody lives the way Plato wants them to, but if you try, you will be destroyed. Okay? That's his real answer as to why he is not going to advise people the way Plato did. Okay? Because you will be destroyed if you try to actually sincerely follow these beliefs. And what is the good of that? Okay? Now Socrates, of course, you know his answer was, even if you have to be destroyed, if you've lived a dignified life and you've stuck to the truth, then it's better that way. Okay? If you have to die for your beliefs, then go ahead and do that if you must. Machiavelli would laugh at that whole notion. Okay? There's really nothing worth dying for. I mean, you can get the citizens to do that because they believe that, but, that's not exactly the case. I mean, what's important is that you remain effective. If you're dead, you cannot provide the security and the other good things for people. So you have to learn to preserve yourself. And so he says at the end of that passage, for anyone who wants to act the part of a good man in all circumstances will bring about his own ruin. Those he has to deal with will not all be good. So it is necessary for a ruler, if he wants to hold on to power, to learn how to be not good, and to know when it is and when it is not necessary to use this knowledge. Okay? So in the place of the sort of rigid moral framework of somebody like Plato or somebody like a Christian author, okay, where there's a clear right and a clear wrong, you're always better going with the right no matter what risks you take. Machiavelli presents a different way of looking at morality entirely. He is saying you cannot be rigid, you have to be flexible. You can act good some of the time, but some of the times you have to act badly, and you cannot be tied to the good. You cannot have your allegiance in the good, because that will make you too inflexible. Okay? So, it's all about how to act in any particular circumstance. Some circumstances you can act good. In fact, it benefits you. But in many instances, you have to act badly, and that will benefit you. Okay? So you have to think about only your own benefit when you decide how to behave. All right? So this is his reason, and it has to do with human nature. If you want to find out basically where a philosopher comes from, just ask, what's his view of human nature? Machiavelli believes that man by nature is not good. Okay? Sure, there are a few people out there who sort of break that rule, but they're the exception. Okay? Very small exception. But the vast, vast majority are not really good, not in that ultimate metaphysical sense of, sacrificing themselves for the ideal. Okay? And that's the world in which we live, so we have to learn to fit that circumstance. And that means the art of creating the semblance of goodness. Okay? Instead of being good interiorly, instead of being good really, you now need to develop the ability to seem good. Okay? Even when you're doing bad things, as we'll find out. So that goodness becomes a sort of propaganda tool, or an image to be projected without any concern for what its true meaning is. Okay? And this goes along with his concern for the people too, because it is the people's view of the prince that is so very important. It's their perception. Again, this is very modern. Now it's very, commonplace to say, what's the popular opinion? We go take polls constantly, and it has a lot to do with if the people think that the leader is basically good and has a good moral agenda. Okay? So Machiavelli is saying here, way ahead of popular opinion polls, what really matters is the perception of the people. So you have to get very good at this, but not be tied or wedded to that goodness, but know how to project it. Okay? Now, what type of people must Machiavelli's prince count on? Okay? What type of common people must he be counting on? This is the flip side. This shows a little lack of respect for the people, because Machiavelli, of course, wants the prince and leaders to be very astute, skeptical, clear-eyed about human nature and so forth. But he counts on the people being very gullible. They are not astute. They are not skeptical. They are not clear-eyed about people. That's how you can manipulate them. If they were as skeptical as the prince about everything, you could never lead them. Okay? And actually, during the Enlightenment, a couple of centuries later, that's exactly what started to happen. And as we move into the modern world, people become ever more skeptical. Okay? And it gets harder to rule them and manipulate them. Okay? But, at this time, it was more easy to say that you could count on this about the people. He goes so far as to say, the people believe only in the outward appearance of a thing. They see only the outcome and the appearance of a thing. They never ask what really went on, what really was going on behind the scenes. They are very satisfied with the superficial appearance. Okay? All right, so Machiavelli's successful or ideal prince is one who is bold and cunning, but now we have added a new dimension. He is a manipulator of perceptions. Okay? And again, I would say this is part of what makes Machiavelli such a modern philosopher, even though he's writing in the 16th century. Because he can see the power of the people, and he can see the relationship between the government and the people, and this dimension of popularity and manipulation of popular opinion. Way ahead of his time. Okay. Now I'm not going to go too far, but I'm going to move ahead past what I assigned your reading to, so that we make sure that we have everything done before the exam. Sometimes that happens. I'm sure you won't mind, because this will give you a better idea of what's going on in these chapters that you're going to be reading. Okay? But first, let me ask you, do you have any questions about chapter 15 and the whole message that comes out of that, of how Machiavelli views himself? Okay. Well, now what I want to do is turn to the virtues, that is, the different aspects of virtue that Machiavelli starts to go into in chapter 16 and on. We've already looked at an example of this first aspect of virtue, which is cruelty well used. Okay? Cruelty is an important tool for the prince to use, but it cannot be used indiscriminately or wantonly. It has to be used very wisely and sparingly, and with political manipulation. Okay? In other words, you can't just go out and bash people and expect that to work. You have to have an ultimate plan, an idea of what you're doing it for. And this is something Cesare had so well in his view. Okay? Because he used somebody else to be cruel, then he came along and was cruel to this man and made a public display of him, gained the authority and legitimacy from the people, and then set up good laws. Okay? So he did everything well. He used cruelty up front to make a point and to establish law and order, and then he stopped it. Okay? And Cesare did it clear-eyed, without any passion, because he just simply knew that's what it took to pacify this area. Okay? He wasn't thinking about getting anybody, taking revenge. He wasn't taking delight in being cruel to people. Okay? So then he stopped it as soon as it no longer looked necessary to use. Okay? Also in chapter 16, you'll see some good examples of cruelty well used. So I would say that is one of the top aspects of virtue, knowing how to use cruelty well. All right. In chapter 16, you also get this idea that you need to be, quote, parsimonious. In fact, that's part of the title of the chapter. Okay? That you should not be liberal, but you should be parsimonious. Okay. Well, now we need to examine what these words mean. Okay. Because, today we use the term liberal to mean left wing, or, having a, agenda to the left of center or whatever, okay? Machiavelli's not using liberal in that way. At least not entirely like we would think of it, okay? Liberal means to him generosity, okay? Now, for those conservatives who think that liberals are big spenders, okay, there might be some tie there, okay? But really, at his time, there was no ideology that corresponded to the left and right that we have, okay? So, what he's arguing is that you should be stingy with your money, or parsimonious, that's what parsimony means, to be thrifty or stingy, instead of to be generous. Okay? Now, what we need to figure out is why. Okay? Because you would think that generosity would certainly win you the approval of the people. Okay? Generosity at this time could include things like, providing festivals, wine, okay? Other benefits that, that people need, food, okay, when they run into trouble. Okay? So, and generosity could also include not doing things to people, but I think what he's talking about here is lavishing on people things, right? Well, the problem with that whole approach is, first of all, there's something not here, I think, that, it sort of is there, but anyway, one problem with this is that if you're too generous with people, they just basically hold you in contempt and expect you to give ever more. You become a sugar daddy, basically, and they're always looking to you to give them more, but they don't necessarily appreciate what they've been given. Okay, so there's that problem. But what he first starts out on is, okay, if you want to be generous and you think that will make you loved, where will you get the money? Well, one way to get money is to take it from other people in other lands, and that sometimes works. Although in this day, most of that stuff went to the troops and not to everybody else, but they would come home with spoils that they got from war and so forth. But you can't count on that. That's not a steady flow of income. And so if you want to do big things for people, you're going to have to tax them. You're going to have to take the money from the people in order to do things for the people. Okay? So you will need lots of money. But then Machiavelli asks, well, what will happen if you take more money from the people? Isn't this interesting? It's like, some economic thought going on in the Prince. He says that if you take too much money from the people, then they won't have that money, those resources, to spend on their own enterprises. Okay? Now, for the serfs, this would mean, impoverishing them in food and supplies so much that they cannot even farm their land well. They don't have enough labor to use, or enough equipment or seed or whatever to use. But for artisans, this would mean maybe not being able to keep their equipment up, not being able to buy supplies that they need to make the products that they make. Okay? So, and the more that this happens, the poorer your people will get, he says, and then the less money you will have. Okay? And this becomes a vicious cycle. If you get into this cycle and you take too much from your people, then in order to get more, you're going to have to be cruel to them. You're going to have to go and take things from them. And unlike our experience now where, people gripe about the IRS, oh, they're taking too much of my money, and yikes, it hurts. But the IRS, well, not always, but rarely comes to your door with arms and says either pay up now or going to burn your house down, okay? But that's what happened back then in a lot of cases. The nobles would they'd do things like this. They'd come right to your house, torch it, if you had refused to pay. All right, so really big, consequences come to the people, and then you will get their hatred. So, and you'll be left in a situation where you cannot please all people because you don't have enough money. So then you turn back to pleasing who? The nobility. Okay, which is the mode that most of these princes were in. Take from the people whatever you could get, give as much of it to yourself and your nobles as possible. Okay? Well, you cannot run a government like Machiavelli suggests on that basis. Okay? So Machiavelli says, in order to be popular, actually, okay, don't care if your people call you stingy. Don't worry about that. If you get a reputation for being stingy or too tight with your money, okay, they may gripe about that a little bit, but you know what? After a while, when they look around and see what's happening to people in other places, how their homes are being burnt down, how their food is being taken from them, they're going to end up thinking that you're generous by comparison. Okay? So that your stinginess turns into liberality in their eyes. Okay? Simply because you don't take so much from them, you allow them to use more of their product for themselves and to become more prosperous. And of course, Machiavelli ultimately points back to the fact that you get more money in that way. You get more from them, the better off they are. Okay? So you don't have to take as high a percentage, but the more prosperous your people are, the more prosperous you are as a government. Okay? So, does anybody have any questions about that? That's kind of an intricate argument, but he's advocate of fiscal responsibility, I guess, or something like that. He doesn't want the government to spend too much, because then that starts a spiral of overtaxing, hurting people economically, which then turns into worse government, because the government appears to be cruel and so forth. Okay. And again, remember, this, taxation was very direct, so that's partly where he's coming from. Yes.
When you say, I don't care if people call you stingy, are you talking about both the nobility and the peasants? Or?
Yes, right. No, both the nobility and the peasants. The peasants, they're really, they gripe a little bit, but they don't really, mean much by that and so forth, as long as you leave them alone. Now, the nobles, when they gripe about your stinginess, you may have more to worry about, because they might take it out on you. If you're giving too much credence to the people's needs and not enough to theirs. But Machiavelli, his advice seems to be to weaken them as much as possible. If you could get rid of them, so much the better. That's the interesting thing about Machiavelli. They're a problem. So if you can impoverish them, great. If you can kill them off in battle, great. Pit them against each other, good. Somehow weaken them, get rid of them as much as possible. And actually, Machiavelli is living at a time that is the very beginning of a big economic boom in Europe, where a new class of people rises up, the middle class or the bourgeois class. Okay? And they start to do this. The nobles get poorer and poorer, because their old base of power and money, the serfdom, is going away. These people are leaving. They're doing other things with their time and with their money. And so, oddly, a couple of centuries later, you've got these old families living in their palaces, poor, and you've got these new people who come from the lowliest of stock, who are rich. And that's why people start to gain more power in the parliaments in Europe, because they have more money than this blue blood class, which is starting to go away. So Machiavelli sees that, I think. He sees that trend coming, that the time for the people is at hand, and they're not going, this feudalism is not going to last much longer. Okay? Even at this time, the lords are starting to sell or grant the lands of the serfs to them, and making more and more of them independent, because the serfs are starting to be a liability economically to them. So it's already starting to happen. And so yeah, he definitely worries about the nobles, but his advice is to try to get them as weak as possible, so that they will not do any harm to you out of their resentment. Okay? Actually, at the beginning of the book, he recommends killing them, if you can. But, different circumstances call for different measures. Okay, finally, last aspect of virtue before we go, and this goes back to your question. You need to be feared but not hated. And, of course, we generally think that these things go together. But if you think of the example of, say, the father or parental figure, okay? Now, in our times, this is not really the model of parenting, but, my childhood and back beyond that, it is the stern father figure who loves his children but is not very loving in the sense of very expressive and emotional and so forth. He's not very generous with his affection. However, he sets up rules, okay? And if you obey them, you're approved of, and if you disobey them, you're going to be punished, okay? And I'm here to tell you that there are many people from my generation and previous who very much love their father, even though they behave like this, because they got the sense that the father was basically doing what was in their best interest, as long as the father was not wantonly cruel, okay? So this is the type of model that I think he's shooting for. You fear the father or the prince if you do wrong, but because his rules seem legitimate and you only are punished if you violate them, you can respect the father or the prince. Okay? You can respect him and even love him in a way because he is not abusing his power. Okay? So that's not the correct page number. That's from a previous book. Let me see if I can find it though. Okay, so he says on the middle of page 52, "For it is perfectly possible to be feared and not hated. You will be hated only if you seize the property of the women of your subjects, the property or the women of your subjects and citizens. Whenever you have to kill someone, make sure that you have an suitable excuse and an obvious reason. But above all else, keep your hands off other people's property, for men are quicker to forget the death of their father than the loss of their inheritance." Okay. Wow. Keep your hands off of people's property or their family. Okay. And you will not be hated. And it is possible to be feared and respected, if not loved, at the same time. So this is the ideal that Machiavelli has. So when we come back next week, I'll start up there. Okay.